Hello and welcome to this series of today's episode of Lived Experience for Everyone. And today we are delighted to welcome Callid Keefe-Perry. Callid is Assistant Professor of Contextual Education and Public Theology at Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry. Callid is the author of a number of books, Way to Water, a Theopoetics Primer and Sense of the Possible, an Introduction to Theology and Imagination, along with numerous articles and book chapters on imagination, education, spirituality. Callid also serves as a travelling minister within the Religious Society of Friends, where he works primarily as a retreat leader and writer of adult faith formation resources. We're really excited because Callid has a forthcoming book called Tending Call, a Liberation Theology of Vocation, which will be published in February 2026. And we're really delighted to speak with him today about this new work. So you're welcome, Callid.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here with you, and thanks for the invitation. Always was a pleasure to talk with folks for whom these are kind of life-giving issues.
Yeah. I'd just love to begin, Callid, by asking you about this new book that you have. We want to speak about your other work as well, but if we sort of look at this new book, and particularly the origins of this new book, Tending Call, and that language of call is very central within the book. So maybe what called you toward writing this work on vocation?
Yeah, so I this year is my 12th year professionally doing the work of working in theological education and working with students as they're doing the work of discerning and vocation. So trying to ask themselves, like, what do they think they want to do with their lives? Or especially for those of us that are theists and Christians in this context, like, what do we think God wants us to do with our lives? I'm here at Boston College working primarily with lay Catholic students. And before I was here, I was working with Methodists, and that was a mix of lay students and people who are pursuing the ordination. And so having done it for more than a decade, kind of accompanying people as they're in their ministry, internships and doing supervision and formation and reflection and all of those kinds of things, I had gotten to the point where, you change things up year to year to kind of stay present with what's being published and what the needs of the students are. But I was always assigning X, Y, and Z. And then the commentary was like, here's what Z is lacking. Here's what X is lacking. Here's what's off on Y. And at some point in time, actually, my wife was said, why don't you just like make your own book so that you don't have to do that every time? And I had been kicking that around for a number of years. And then honestly, it was kind of providential. I had a major research project lined up for something else that required a lot of funding and field work. And a grant that I had thought was a done deal didn't come through. And so then I had 6 months that I was planning to be, out on the road doing qualitative research and interviews and things just evaporated. And so in this space, instead of kind of twiddling my thumbs or crying myself to sleep, I decided I would shift my energy towards doing this thing, which had been on the back burner for a long time. And I reached out to the publisher and I said, hey, what do you think about this book? And essentially, I attached all my notes from class and I said, what if this was in book form? And they quickly said, yep. And I said, great. And then started to work on it right away.
I think a book on vocation, particularly working within that lay context, is very very important, for today. I'd love to ask you a little bit about just that idea of vocation, just even as a kind of a term, because I grew up here in Ireland. And the word vocation, it always meant one thing, and that was priesthood. So the last few decades, particularly, there has been this kind of constant narrative of vocations crisis, declining numbers, empty seminaries, and this pressure to get vocations. And it's really shaped, I think, how many of us have imagined ministry, imagined faith as a layperson. And it's almost like the only call that really mattered was the clerical call, or everything else got pushed to the side. So vocation was kind of framed very narrowly. And it doesn't really invite people into purpose, into imagination, into flourishing. And one of the things I love about what you have done in this book is you've widened precisely vocation, what it means as something evolving, something dynamic. It's not just a rare voice heard by a select few. So that every person has a vocation. So maybe can I ask you a little bit about that, just particularly the context, like what I speak of, this kind of growing up with this narrow understanding of vocation, and what shift do you hope to make within this book? Would you describe this kind of more wider, more life-giving way of thinking about the vocation that you're writing about, that you offer?
Yeah, thanks. And my positionality is, I think, kind of really part of the story here, right? That I'm a friend, a member of the Religious Society of Friends. Most folks call us Quakers, and there's just so few of us anywhere, that, like, I've always been teaching kind of across tradition. So I began adjuncting with American Baptists, and later was lecturer and faculty with the Methodists and doing formation there. And now I'm here in a Jesuit Catholic institution. And none of those are my home other than they're Christian, which is kind of my primary identification. But of course, the particulars of the different traditions really sound quite different. So, regarding the kind of Catholic language around the crisis of vocations or things like that, that's certainly language that exists in the United States too. And one of the pieces that I think is true about the book that is tricky, and a number of people have commented on, is it isn't really a book for lay people or for people moving into the clergy. It's really for people. And I was really very much kind of affirmed and felt some great ease regarding some of the conversation and language that was coming out of Pope Francis when he was writing and living. And one of the things that Francis says in a number of places, but he says there's vocations within vocations. So even those people who are clergy, who have already taken vows or are sure what path they're on, there's paths within paths within paths within paths. It's not a once and done kind of thing. And working here at Boston College with the Jesuits, one of the conversations I had from a number of people is that language around the crisis of vocation, and everyone's still fixating on vocation, meaning you're becoming a religious, priest or nun or brother or something like that. There's a lot of lament that I was hearing from my Catholic colleagues because Vatican II is supposed to start to undo that. Right. And we were supposed to see a shift in the 70s and 80s and moving forward towards a broader understanding. And in fact, there's a bunch of Catholic documents that are part of Vatican II, which said that explicitly, that we need to think about the universal call to holiness, the universal ways in which we're all going to engage in kind of evangelistic ministry, not as proselytizing per se, but about everyone's particular call to whatever it is God is calling them. And for various cultural and political reasons, which are kind of like outside of my wheelhouse of expertise, it just didn't happen that way. It didn't kind of propagate the way that I think a lot of Catholic thinkers did. But it's also true, at least in the States, and I don't know about what it looks like in your neck of the woods, but at seminaries and divinity schools and theologiates, many of them in mainline Protestantism and in Catholicism, the number of students who are actually pursuing the priesthood, or in pastoral context, pastoral ministry in general, is like less than half of everyone who's coming to school. So there's people who are coming to do graduate work for the sake of their own spiritual formation and upbuilding of faith, but they're not intending to take vows to become clergy, really of any sort, unless people understand, lay ministry as part of that call. And so the question is, like, we built these things, schools, as if everyone walking in the door was going to become a priest or pastor. And that's just not true and hasn't been for quite a while. But we haven't really done any fundamental reshifting of like what exactly we're doing here. And so I know I'm under no illusions that this book is going to be a kind of like world-changing thing. But part of what it is a manifestation of is what if we took seriously what's actually in front of us today and looks like the future is going to be, and figure out how to talk about God's call on us with what's in front of us and not just what we imagined the past was.
Yeah, and it's very timely with synodality as well, because there's a whole kind of movement now towards more like lay vocation and the baptism and who we are as baptized Christians, and yeah, we see that. And particularly, I suppose, in fairness, within the Irish context as well, there is more of a culture of vocation now that is starting to emerge. We see new ministries, for example, across dioceses. So there has been a change in that way too. I think Vatican II is still being very much lived out. But can I ask you another kind of slant then on this area of your book? And it's you use the liberation theology lens to look at vocation, because you say that it's not vocation isn't purely an individual experience, that it always is shaped by our social location. And you're very honest in, how some people's calls are affirmed quickly, while others have to fight to have that call, I suppose, recognized, especially if they have identities within churches or institutions that maybe have been historically marginalized. And, you name some of that. But you bring in this kind of liberation theology lens, and it's not just about personal discernment. And you use the term systems thinking, so that vocations isn't only personal. So it's almost entangled in the systems we're part of. Could you maybe speak a little about that?
Yeah. Um, I'm always thrilled if someone can share with me a story about how they heard God's call clear and plain, and it just came to them, fell out of the sky one day, and they were able to discern it to be true. Their community affirmed it, and they were able to go about and live their life. But the number of people for whom that's their experience is relatively small. A lot of the times, kind of learning what you're called to comes from other people's feelings or your experience when you were doing service, or a faculty person or a mentor or an older person or a spiritual director. The list goes on and on and on and on. Um, and the question there becomes, how do you kind of frame what it is that kind of things can look like in the context of relatedness, right? And the fact of the matter is, not all people are related to the same. And so we have to
Mm.
take seriously that our embeddedness, our contextualization within communities, within traditions, within culture,
Mm.
actually impacts what it is we hear and what it is we perceive. Kind of in a technical way, I'm very interested in kind of interpretation. Um, and that has always been a kind of key kind of method thing for me. Always ask, like, how does the container shape
Mm.
the thing in the container? And so, if you live in a world where vocation has meant the priesthood and people who are entering into religious life, and it's been that way for centuries, and now it's changed, it's still going to have marks of the tradition that came behind it, which is different, for example, than my tradition, which has been we abolished the laity in the 1650s, and
Mm.
we said everyone is called to ministry. And then those of us that are what look like to everyone else clergy, all we are is just public ministers,
Yeah.
as opposed to being a minister and they're not.
Yeah.
And so that changes depending on context and culture and container. And so for me, the liberation tradition has always been about paying attention to material conditions.
Mm.
Like, what is the nature of the kind of the lives we live on this earth, and start with people's experience of that as really important. And when you do that and you ask them how they feel called, what do they think they're supposed to do with their lives, the kinds of conversations you get to have are slightly different than the ones based on conversations with priests from 500 years ago.
Yeah.
Can I jump in here and ask a question as well about vocation? Such an interesting topic as well. Somebody like my little brother, Alex. Hey, Alex, how are you? He likes to listen. Um, he's an engineer. He works on cars. He loves it. I think he might consider what he does to be his vocation. This is for connoisseurs. There's a German philosopher from a couple hundred years ago, part of what you call the German idealist tradition, named Johannes Fichte. I can't say Fichte too loud. My German partner laughs at me. Apparently, that's a very naughty word in German. But if you say Fichte, he was a German idealist. He wrote a book called The Vocation of Man. And then some other German philosophers in the 20th century in phenomenology, like Max Scheler and Edmund Husserl, they also talk about a kind of non-theological, non-religious idea of vocation. I think what they're talking about is our vocation is what is it we think to be a fulfilled human. Our vocation is to pursue excellence or to pursue the best of humanity. Um, I don't know if that kind of vocation, that kind of concept or vocabulary fits within yours. I feel like it might, that our vocation, regardless of what our particular career is, has something to do with liberation theology or even just liberating, the work of liberation. Would that be at all on the right track, or does that inform your work at all?
Um, Not the European traditions kind of directly, but my work in general, but certainly in this kind of book, which is kind of self-styled as a liberation theology, is grounded in the Brazilian liberation tradition. In particular, I'm very significantly formed by the um, theologian and psychoanalyst Rubem Alves, but then also Paulo Freire, with the critical pedagogy scholar and practitioner whose work was really at the root of a lot of the work that became Latin American liberation theology. So Gustavo Gutierrez, who is sometimes called the father of liberation theology, somewhere in the middle of his first book of liberation theology, kind of he stops for a moment and he says, "Hey, if you want to know where this already exists and you could go look at, check out the work of educator Paulo Freire and what he's doing in terms of adult literacy and work in the favelas, the kind of the barrios, the poor communities. Go take a look at that because it's already happening. It's not just pie in the sky." And Alves, whose first book on liberation precedes Gutierrez, but doesn't get the kind of citation a lot of other people want to give to Gutierrez. He was part of those same conversations with Freire, also in Brazil. And so what Freire says about vocation, which is in the book, but is also very near and dear to kind of my other work, is he says, one of the things that it means to be human, right? He says there's this ontological vocation, which is the fancy way of saying like deep into the being of what it means to be human, deep in what it means that human being is when it's being, is a call to be more human. Which is when I talk about it and teach it, I always kind of make it an upward spiral, right? So that Freire says that our job is to kind of recognize the incompleteness of humanity, not as a failure or a lack by God or some sense of like the insufficiency of the inbreaking kingdom of heaven or anything like that, but just like by our nature, we're set up to be able to increasingly participate in kind of God's movement in the world, which means we always have more that we can do. And eventually, and later critical pedagogues will kind of say, eventually that means we realize it's not just me becoming more and more and more and more, but that I can't do that without you and you and you and you. And we need to engage in the work of freeing everyone so that everyone can be free. So there is for Freire a clear tie to Catholic spirituality, but there's also a kind of humanistic perspective in there, and personalism was part of his world. And to some degree, that idea that what it means to be human is to be able to pursue increasing humanity, I think cuts across religious traditions. He's a Christian, and it's inside of there, and you can't understand his education theory and his teaching theory and his thoughts about liberation without understanding his spirituality. But he also doesn't need you to buy into his particular doctrinal or religious commitments to say, yeah, I do kind of feel like what it is to be a human is to constantly be on the journey of figuring out what this whole thing's about.
Yeah, I just want to back up for a second, just to reinforce Paulo Freire for our listeners. Anybody out there who might be interested in reading him, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, really excellent, lively text, gets you thinking about subconscious structures that you're not even aware of, in which you might be the oppressor or you might be the victimizer. It's a really powerful book. So thanks for bringing that up, Callid. I'd forgotten about Paulo Freire. Um, and I know that liberative action takes imagination. Do you see what I did there as a transition to your earlier work on the imagination? Sometimes I feel like imagination might be the polar opposite of concrete political action. Imagination sometimes seems abstract, or like I'm living in my own worlds, or I'm fantasizing. But your book, Sense of the Possible, I've been poring over lately. Really excellent, wonderful analysis of just exploring what imagination is and how it might inform and enrich one's faith, whatever tradition that is. But I'm wondering if we can speak a little bit more about what you think imagination is doing. Now, we won't go through all of it. You have a lot there, so I highly recommend the book again to the listeners, Senses of the Possible. But a couple of chapters talk a lot about the dark underside of imagination, if I could put it that way, that when we use our imagination, we can also fantasize and perhaps become out of touch with reality. So you talk a little bit about the two types of imagination, that which puts us in touch with reality, and that's which does not. I'm wondering if you could tease that out a bit more for us.
Yeah. So for me, and I differ somewhat from some of my other kind of colleagues and scholars of imagination, but I actually think it's important to kind of recognize that the things that we call types are actually just different kinds of functions. I actually don't think there's different types in a kind of deep-seated way, in what we might technically say is like metaphysical. So like deep down in their guts, this is one thing and this is another thing. I actually don't think that's the case. I talk about imagination as the human capacity to bring into consciousness things that are not observably present, and how that functions can function across a continuum. So the example I give in the book is, you know, if you are a small child and you grew up watching Star Trek, you don't think that teleporters and replicators and holodecks and flying through the stars is real in a kind of thing that you can touch kind of way, but it might have inspired you and kind of made you start to imagine what it would be if. And we know from self-disclosure that a lot of the people who made the first iPads and got into NASA and started doing the work on space travel did so because they were inspired about this vision, this fictional vision of Roddenberry and Star Trek that made them want to pursue science and engineering. And then lo and behold, we now have some technologies that look a lot like what it is we were watching on TV in the 70s and 80s and 60s for that matter. So in that way, the imagination brought into consciousness this fictive world of the 21st century and 24th century and space travel and all these things. But then it kind of gained purchase on our lives in a material way, such that some of those things could be produced. So in the one sense, it was taking this fictional world, and then inside of it, we were having experiences that allowed for us to kind of carve out the possibility of a future horizon that then allowed us to kind of do a thing to kind of bring it into reality. It was a fictive reality that kind of brought us into the possibility of an actual thing. But It's also the case that a similar thing can happen if someone who is an engineer at a firm that makes cars, for your brother Alex there, goes in and does a conversation for a bunch of secondary school kids and says, hey, you too could be an engineer someday. That's also imagination. But that imagination isn't a fictive reality. It's an actual reality from a different context being ported into these young adolescents who say, oh, I never imagined myself doing a thing like this Alex guy is doing. He's telling me I could do it. So what's interesting there is they're operating in very similar ways, even though one's a quote fiction and one of them is a life. And that's because whenever we imagine the future, we're imagining. Like whenever you get out of the present, you're doing the imaginative work of trying to figure out what it is it would feel like, be like, to kind of live into some future moment.
Okay. Okay. So this is helpful. So there's not, rigid types of imagination. There's just imagination as a organ of our mind and our sense of self, and we automatically imagine all the time. And you have a really excellent definition that teases out what you just described a second ago. You use David Abram, a great philosopher, and you say, kind of drawing on his work, that imagination is the way the senses themselves have of throwing themselves beyond what is immediately given in order to make tentative contact with the other sides of things that we do not sense directly, with the hidden or invisible aspects of the sensible, going beyond what is given. That's a really beautiful way to put it, but I'm wondering if I could back up again. What is fantasy-prone imagination? What's the dark underbelly of this continuum? If there's a continuum, maybe it moves towards one end being healthy and constructive,
Yeah.
and enriching our lives and other people's lives, and maybe towards the other end of the spectrum,
Yeah.
it's fantasy-prone. What does that
Yeah.
mean?
So I want to be clear to make a distinction